morning. I am so excited to introduce our next speaker. It's someone who I've known my entire life, which I know makes me probably a little bit biased, but it also means that I'm extremely knowledgeable. My mother raised me and my sister Kamala to believe that we could do anything that we put our minds to, that we could be whoever we wanted to be, but more importantly, that we could and we really should use our time and our talents to help make the world a better place, to help create more fairness, more equity, more justice. To whom much is given, much is expected, my mother would always remind us. So after graduating from Howard University and UC Hastings College of the Law, and serving for several years as a prosecutor, in 2003, Kamala decided against all odds, and I mean really against all odds, to run for district attorney of the city and county of San Francisco, and she won, which made her the first woman elected DA in San Francisco, the first black woman elected DA in the state of California, and the first woman of South Asian descent elected to be DA anywhere in the United States. In 2010, she made history again by becoming elected the first woman, first African American, and first South Asian Attorney General of the state of California. And just two weeks ago, in what was a bright spot in the 2014 election cycle, she was reelected to her second term. Yeah, that's a good thing. But Kamala's election has meant a lot more than just being a symbol of historic firsts. It's meant a refreshing take on the criminal justice system and public safety. She's been a pioneer in rejecting the false choice between being soft or tough on crime and instead promoting a smart on crime approach that has included groundbreaking, innovative prevention programs, alternatives to incarceration, and creating a new division in the Justice Department to fight recidivism with data-driven solutions. It's meant a strong voice for the voiceless. Kamala led the fight to deliver relief to California homeowners and hold the nation's banks accountable, and she wrote the nation's first and toughest mortgage reform package and fought for it until it was signed into law. When comprehensive immigration reform stalled at the national level, it's meant having an attorney general in the most diverse state in the nation working with law enforcement to ensure that immigrant crime victims and witnesses could come forward without fear of deportation. And it's meant having a top cop in the biggest state in the nation who not only leads a multi-jurisdictional effort to combat transnational organized crime, but who has also prioritized bringing to justice human traffickers who threaten the dignity and the safety of women and children. Kamala, I think, embodies the best of what CAP stands for. Bold, courageous leadership. She's an innovator and a problem solver, a champion for progressive values. I'm so proud of her, and I'm so pleased to introduce her. Please join me in welcoming the Attorney General for the great state of California, Kamala Harris.
I'm going to tell a story about me. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Maya. I just told her I'm going to tell a story about my sister. My sister, Maya Harris, who, as you all know, was the previous vice president of the Ford Foundation and is now a visiting scholar at CAP, is one of the smartest people I know. And just to give you a little context in terms of where this all started and how it has been consistent, my sister Maya, when I believe she was in 5th grade, was so dissatisfied with the amount of homework that she was being given in class that would, in addition to doing that homework, assign herself homework. She is one of the smartest and the best people I know, and of course my sister, and I love her. I want to thank John Podesta for all that you had in terms of vision. Over a decade ago to create this organization as a place where we could come in one room together around the world and talk about progressive values and how we can inform public policy for our country and by extension for the world. Thank you, John Podesta. And Neera Tandon, she's amazing, an extraordinary leader doing very difficult times, as we know, certainly in the last election cycle, but she endures, and I think she thrives off of the challenges that we face, and she's a true leader for all of us. So I want to thank you, Neera. And I'm certainly very grateful for the Center for American Progress and all of its ideas and work. So I've been thinking a lot about what I would say here today, and there is a lot I would love to talk with you about and discuss. I am obsessed with an issue, many, one of them being adoption of technology. I strongly believe in order for us to be progressive in the policy work that we want to do through government, government needs to upgrade and update itself, and in particular have a commitment to adoption of technology in general and through law enforcement in particular. I could talk for quite some time about that. I think a lot about issues that, by extension, in this new world of technology, we must discuss a lot more, and that's the issue of privacy. Would love to talk at some point about that. And of course, I think about the environment as we do, all of us. And when I prioritize that in terms of the policy work that we do in the California Department of Justice, it is not because I necessarily have any strong urge to hug a tree, but I have a very strong urge to hug a healthy baby. And when I think about issues that impact our environment, we all know there's a direct connection between that and the health and safety and well-being of human beings. But Nira has only given me 15 minutes. And so I have chosen, because in general I have reluctantly but fully embraced the concept of triage, that I would like to discuss today issues that I believe face us in terms of the work we can do to improve criminal justice policy in the United States, to do the work that I think and frame as being smart on crime. A rejection of criminal justice policy notions that suggest that one is either soft or tough. Instead, let us be smart on crime. So I would like to talk about that, but also given that I'm in Washington, D.C. this week, and we know what the president, we believe what the president is about to do on immigration, I would also just take 2 minutes to say that I think for California and our Department of Justice, we are going to renew the resources that we have been putting into prosecution of fraud and crimes perpetrated against immigration and immigrants in particular. And I would call on the Attorneys General of the United States to do the same and put resources into this issue, because as we know with the rollout, we are going to see predators in the form of notarios, in the form of immigration consultants. We will see in this environment those who will commit fraud against immigrants by spreading false information. And it should be incumbent on the Attorneys General of the United States to prioritize this as an issue and to do the work. I would call on everyone of the work that we did before with unaccompanied minors, which is reaching out to our brothers and sisters in law firms to dedicate pro bono hours to assisting these immigrants with their path forward. So with that, smart on crime. So my career in many ways has been informed by the circumstances of my birth. I am one of 2 daughters, me and Maya, who were born of parents who met when they were graduate students at the University of California, Berkeley in the 1960s. They met when they were actively involved in the civil rights movement, which meant for Maya and me, as we like to joke, that we grew up surrounded by a bunch of adults who spent full time marching and shouting about this thing called justice. And growing up in that environment, the heroes among many were the lawyers, the architects of the civil rights movement. Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, Constance Baker Motley, who understood the skill of this great profession of law to translate the passion from the streets to the courtrooms of our country, to do the work that unfortunately needed and still needs to be done, of reminding folks of that great promise we articulated in 1776. We are all and should be treated as equals. So at a very young age, I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. I went on to Howard, went to law school, and as Maya said, in law school, I made the decision about what I wanted to do with my career, and my family gathered around. Okay, Kamala, what are you going to do in your fight for justice? And I was very excited to share with them that I had decided to become a prosecutor. And some of you laugh because you have a sense of who my family is. And so they thought, well, that's an interesting, if not curious, decision. And with some of them, indeed, I had to defend the decision like one would a thesis. But what I said then is what I absolutely maintain today after a career as a prosecutor. Law enforcement has such a profound and direct impact on the most vulnerable among us, and has as its responsibility, as its job, to be a voice for the voiceless. And in the process of giving safety, there is also the responsibility to give dignity. So that's why I decided I wanted to become a prosecutor. I was a line prosecutor in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office that Earl Warren once headed. I've prosecuted everything from low-level offenses to homicides, standing before juries talking about why the law in civil society requires that there will be swift and severe consequence, in particular when one human being kills another human being, when a woman is raped, when a child is molested. That's the work I did as a line prosecutor, then went on to be the elected district attorney of San Francisco, and now I stand before you as the chief law enforcement officer of the most populous state in our country. And all of these experiences then have led me to a belief that we must and can do better with criminal justice policy in our country. And in particular, as I mentioned, be smart on crime. So what does that mean? It means recognizing that crime is essentially on a pyramid in terms of the amount that it's out there and the space it is occupying in terms of our public resources. I see crime as being on a pyramid in that at the top of the pyramid, the priority, the most serious and violent crimes. As I mentioned, rape, homicide. Priority for obvious reasons, the toll it exacts on the victim and the community, the outrageousness of the conduct. But thankfully, in that pyramid of what is occupying the space in our system, the majority of what we are dealing with in the criminal justice system is at the middle and the base of that pyramid. But unfortunately in our country, we have adopted a one-size-fits-all approach. We have approached crime as though it is a monolith, when in fact there is a significant difference in terms of the pathology and what should be the response when we are talking about nonviolent, low-level offenses versus serious and violent crime. And I would suggest when we recognize that, we can do better. And so I'll mention with a bit of pride and certainly perhaps a slight amount of bravado, California. And what we like to think of as California exceptionalism. There's the bravado part. So California, we like to think, and certainly we believe that old adage, as goes California goes the rest of the country, and these days by extension the world. And so we have many points of pride, but we also have moments when on criminal justice policy, we recognize that we passed legislation that was some of the toughest and perhaps not the smartest legislation that ended up being passed throughout the country. And then recently we have corrected course. But what we have known in California, like the nation, is that over the last 20+ years, these tough on crime, so-called tough on crime approaches, have in fact resulted in an 800% nationally in incarceration, a rise in incarceration by 800%. And I would suggest it was not and is not smart to have those approaches when we analyze our effectiveness based not on some blind adherence to tradition, but instead analyze our effectiveness as we do well in the public sector by asking, what is the return on the investment? So looking at criminal justice policy in our country and asking that question requires us to accept that the war on drugs was a failure, requires us to accept that we've had a revolving door in and out of prison with large populations of people who are committing, in particular, some of the low-level offenses. In California, for example, for decades until recently, we had a 70% recidivism rate, which is 70% of the offenders being released reoffended within 3 years. We know also when we assess the return on our investment as taxpayers, as residents and citizens of states and of this country, that in California, for example, we have to analyze the economic imperative in terms of the need to be smarter when we see that we spend on an annual basis $14 billion in California on corrections alone. And let's look at the economic costs of crime and recidivism, not only in terms of the public fisc, but let's recognize also the economic cost of crime to struggling communities and struggling families. So, with all of this in mind, I decided to tackle recidivism and reentry, first when I was district attorney and now as Attorney General of the United States. As district attorney, we created an initiative called Back on Track, which was focused on the low-level offender, 18 through 24, nonviolent young adult offenders. And essentially what we did is we created a public-private partnership to address their needs in terms of education, skills development, job skills development, what they needed in terms of assistance with parenting their children, housing, and so on. As a result of the public-private partnership we created, we reduced the recidivism rate for that particular population from 54% to less than 10%. So then, as Attorney General, we decided to take the show on the road and take it statewide. Last year, we created a new division of the California Department of Justice, which we have named the Division on Recidivism Reduction and Reentry, DR3 we call it. And essentially what we have done there is address the fact that in the most populous state in the country, we have to, if we are going to be smart with limited resources, engage in significant application of policy around this population that otherwise will be one of our highest burdens in terms of their recidivism. And so what we have done in particular through my office is create a pilot in Los Angeles where we are implementing what we call Back on Track Los Angeles, focusing on the lowest offenders and re-entering them into their communities in a way that we will reduce the likelihood that they will re-offend. As of today, we have received $1.5 million from a combination of philanthropy, and Ford Foundation has been a leader there, and from the United States Department of Justice, and in particular the Second Chance Act. What we are doing in California, and in Los Angeles in particular, we believe is a model for the country. And I believe that's why I was asked to meet with the President in the Roosevelt Room several months ago to talk about this work, and why we are doing the work of recognizing that in doing the policy work, it is critical that we also infuse metrics into our analysis of effectiveness, and so we are collecting data so that when we show folks that it's working, it is not just because it may make some people feel good, but also because we can show through metrics that it actually makes sense on paper when we are concerned about the return on our investment. So I think about the work that we've done recently in California and think about it with some level of excitement because we are also seeing in other recent developments that I think we are making progress in the United States on these issues. For example, 2 weeks ago in California, we passed a proposition, an initiative, that reduced low-level drug offenses to misdemeanors. It is estimated that this new policy approach will save us on an annual basis $150 to $200 million a year. And as the legislation was written, as the initiative was written, that savings will go directly to truancy, to recidivism reduction, to mental health, and importantly, to services for victims of crime. And when I look at that issue as an example of where I think we're heading nationally and why I appear to be and am optimistic, let's also recognize that that initiative is probably the only example we will find of Jay-Z and Newt Gingrich coming together. And nationally, of course, we know it's also an exciting time because we've got our great Senator Cory Booker, I know he's going to be here this afternoon, and Senator Rand Paul coming together on this issue. So there's a lot, I think, that gives us hope, but we must be dedicated to the issue of being smart on crime. And I believe being smart on crime means rejecting false choices. And in addition to measuring ROI, it means stopping the cycle of crime as early as possible. And I would suggest as early as possible includes as early as elementary school, which brings me to the significance of elementary school truancy. So some would say, what's the top cop of the biggest state doing talking about elementary school truancy? And I would suggest to you, well, one of the reasons is because of the public health model. What's that? The public health model, tried and true, tells us when dealing with an epidemic, usually we would talk about health, but I'll say crime. The smartest approach, the most effective approach, is prevention. And then if the sniffles take on, early intervention. But if we're dealing with it in the emergency room or prison system, it is much too late and far too expensive. And back on the point of the smart on crime approach, it's about addressing and understanding and appreciating. It's not smart to only put resources into reacting to crime after it occurs. Let's also put equal resources into preventing crime before it occurs. And I'll tell you how I came at this issue of elementary school truancy. Back when I was DA again, we had a rash of homicides. I did an analysis. Who are homicide victims? Victims who are under the age of 25 when they were killed. The data came back and it included the fact that 94% were high school dropouts. Not surprising. When we went to talk with the superintendent of schools, we found that of the chronically and habitually truant students in our public school system, 40% were elementary school students. Missing, in some cases, 50, 60, up to 80 days of a 180-day school year. So I'll tell you a little story. I asked the superintendent to convene a meeting for me with all of the administrators and principals of the school district, and I stood before them then in a public high school auditorium at a podium like this, and I shared with them a fact about myself. I'm a product of California Public Schools. My first grade teacher, blessed and God rest her soul, Mrs. Frances Wilson, attended my law school graduation. I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received, and as we all know, a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So we initiated a policy that directed resources and the infrared spotlight of public safety on the issue of elementary school truancy, and saw great response and improvement of attendance by over 30%. Decided to take it statewide as Attorney General of California, and commissioned my office to do a study, and sure enough, we issued a report, which I believe we have here, In School and On Track, which showed exactly what we knew was happening. 1 million California elementary school students were truant. In the 2012-2013 school year, 250,000 had missed more than 10% of the school year. Over 40,000 had missed over 20% of the school year. Through our study, I learned the significance of word gap. If a child, by the end of age 3, is being raised in a home that is upper middle class, they will have heard 30 million more words than a child being raised in a working poor or public assistance household. I learned the significance, while looking at this issue of elementary school truancy, of 3rd grade reading level. It is undisputed among educational specialists and professionals. If by the end of 3rd grade a child is not at 3rd grade reading level, they literally drop off. They can't and don't catch up. Why? Before 3rd grade, the child is learning to read. Then comprehension kicks in, and they are reading to learn. If they've not learned to read, they cannot then catch up in terms of reading to learn. I'll tell you another point about this, because I talk about it wherever I can. So I've talked about it in places that range from a very, very popular church in Compton, California, to a $50 million home in Malibu, California. And in both places, when we talk about 3rd grade reading level, the audience and the parents, the adults in the room, will express disbelief they didn't know about 3rd grade reading level. Well, for the children in that home in Malibu, I'm not so concerned that their parents not knowing this will affect the education of that child, because of the circumstances and resources that are present in that household and that community. But we know the outcome for the children being raised in Compton will not necessarily be equal. So what we are looking at is, I believe, what we have to do in terms of putting a focus on this issue. Putting a focus on it for that reason, and because what we know, and it's well understood, elementary school truant is 4 times likely to be a high school dropout. 82% of the prisoners in the United States are high school dropouts. An African-American man between the age of 30 and 34, if he is a high school dropout, is 2/3 likely to be incarcerated, have been incarcerated, or dead. When we look at the issue in terms of graduation rates, a 10% increase in graduation rates will lead to a 20% decrease in violent crime. There is a direct connection between what we need to do in terms of public education and what we want in terms of public safety. And there is, of course, the economic consequence of high school dropouts. Our study has shown that annually, every year in California, we pay $46 billion in all of the costs that are associated with the burden placed on our public safety, public health, social services systems by high school dropouts. And our work also reveals there is a significant impact on children of color and poor children. Elementary school students of color are 4.5 times likely to be chronically absent more than white students, and foster, homeless, and migrant children are likely, of course, to be in that population and fall through the cracks. I think all of these facts highlight also that this is not only an issue that is about education, but it makes clear what Brown v. Board of Education made clear, which is that it is also a civil rights issue, and for that reason must be a priority for us. And I would suggest in approaching this from a public policy perspective, it's important that we also reject a paternalistic approach to what invariably happens when we talk about public policy around children in need, which is what? Child in need, knee-jerk reaction, wag, 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 it must be those parents. Instead of informing public policy by the much more accurate premise that the vast majority of parents have a natural desire to parent their children well, but not necessarily the skills or the resources. So let's inform public policy from that perspective, and in our desire and need to improve the condition of that child, craft public policy from a perspective that understands we must do so in the context of that home and supporting the people who are raising that child. And recent developments in California tell us that when we put a focus on this issue, we actually make progress. We have, as a result of issuing the report, now twice, improved pretty significantly attendance in many of the counties, the 58 counties of California. We're seeing impressive results in terms of putting a focus on this from the California Department of Justice and getting people to actually talk about, are the children in school and what are we doing to assist them? We won passage of 2 bills in this last legislative cycle in California that will improve local coordination, because when we look at the issue, of course, everyone has a responsibility to do better. And in particular, we realize that school districts have responsibility in that population to also do better in terms of tracking and counting and coordinating around these children. And nationally, the president has done, I think, very, very important and great work with My Brother's Keeper. And part of the focus there is on attendance rates for the children who are the target of that initiative. Casey Foundation and its campaign for grade level reading is another bright spot. And then, of course, CAP, which is delving into the issue and actually working with our office to produce a truancy policy paper. So in conclusion, I believe that criminal justice is, in terms of policy, is often compartmentalized. And can be overlooked in terms of the national policy debate that occurs. But I believe that if we want an educated and a competitive workforce, if we want to save limited public resources, and if we want to protect our recovering economy, then we need to get smart on crime and focus on a number of these issues, including recidivism reduction, and elementary school truancy. And without a doubt, equality in our criminal justice and our public education systems is our moral imperative. And it goes to the very promise of our nation, that we are all and should be treated as equals. So despite the results in the last election cycle, I think it is truly a very exciting time to be a progressive, and to think about our country in a way that we fight for its ideals and not tire, but find the challenge before us and have the energy to meet it. And I believe that in so doing, we will be smart on crime, we will be smart on government, and we will be smart on our future. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a couple of questions, if there are any questions. Of course I can't see. Sure, right here.
Hi.
This may be implicit in what you're saying, but I suspect to hear a little more explicitly about like the school-to-prison pipeline or the disparities and suspensions and discipline within schools
as well. So I don't know if the question is being recorded, but school to prison pipeline. There's no question, and we can see it in terms of if you look at, for example, I mean, and it's all well documented. CAP has done a great job on it. A number of people have. There's no question, there is a pipeline. And the numbers are clear. The child who's growing up in a family on public assistance is very likely, as we discussed, to be an elementary school truant. Is very likely to become a high school dropout, is very likely to end up in the dependency system or the delinquency system, and straight from there go into the adult criminal justice system. There's no question. And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline then, I think we all talk about it with a goal of ending the pipeline, of shutting it down. In spite of what's happening in terms of other pipelines. And so I think that what we have to do, though, is when we're looking at something that may seem as big and ominous as the school-to-prison pipeline, let's break it down into its discrete parts. And then, for example, approach it from a triage perspective. Each of us wants to take on some piece of it, so let's take it on with gusto and actually deal with it in a very focused way and make some progress. And so I've chosen to focus on elementary school truancy because we see the numbers are there. And we see the numbers are there in terms of also, for example, we see a lot of the children who are the focus of this initiative are growing up in households where family members have been in prison. And, but you know what's interesting in terms of the policy approach is that we also know that in whatever may be the background of the parent has a natural desire to parent that child. And so let's get the parent the resources they need. We find in a lot of these cases, for example, that it may be a single parent, a single mom, who's holding down, I had a case like this, a single mom holding down 2 jobs, raising 3 children, and homeless. She just needed some help. But by focusing on this issue, and focusing on her children, who maybe a lot of people don't expect much from, we can get her the help and access to the services she needs. So this is where we have decided to focus, and as just one piece in the pipeline.
I mean, I really want to support that. I think that I didn't phrase my question as well as I could have. I think there's also the element of racial disparities in school discipline, within schools themselves. Who gets suspended for what infraction?
No question. No question, no question. And we've been actually in California working with Bob Ross from the California Endowment, who's been a leader in California on that issue. No question. Yeah.
We can take one more question? Sure, same to you.
Oh, absolutely. Vina Trahan, one of 2 daughters also, and it's a great thing to sort of grow up in that Indian environment with these high expectations. But I have a question that may seem a little bit off topic, but it relates to vitamin D and the ties to, obviously some of the research is early in terms of school children, but there's more out there in terms of seniors, in terms of it being tied to memory, it being tied to depression, it being tied to distractibility. And I know for myself, I was very low in vitamin D. For example, at the beginning of the year, I couldn't synthesize information. I was not very productive as a writer. And since I've supplemented, like my productivity has gone up 100%. So particularly since minorities are going to be likely to be lower in vitamin D because we don't absorb enough, as much melanin, et cetera, as much from the sun, have we looked at that link? And could we look at actually testing students and then retesting them? The health costs might go up, but if we're focused on the social benefits, you know, potentially if there is some link there, it could be hugely beneficial.
No, you raise an interesting point which I've not looked at yet, because you're now putting that on my list. But I will say that we have addressed the connections in a more general way of between public health and the health of the child, and what might be issues with attendance. So for example, one of our beliefs based on just anecdotal information and some research is dental health is a big issue in terms of whether the child goes to school or not. Literally, if they have a toothache, they're just debilitated. Another issue that invariably comes up in this on this issue is, you know, it's at the earliest ages that when a child is in school, that they may have contact with people other than their family. And it may be at that point that we can detect vision issues, hearing issues, right? And the earlier the better, obviously. because that's when we realize, okay, this is not about the mental and brain capacity of this child. They actually need glasses or a hearing aid. So we do look at the public health implications of attendance, and both in terms of what doesn't happen, but also the causes, what doesn't happen when they're not at school in terms of addressing their public health needs, but also the causes, public health reasons that they may not be in class in the first place. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Kamala Harris.
Thank you. Thank you.